In the mountains of Italy, a starving army stood at the edge of collapse. Then a single voice ignited them, turning hunger into fury and doubt into destiny. What followed was not just victory, but the birth of a legend. The year was 1796, and Italy had become a graveyard of failed ambitions. For centuries, armies marched in, exhausted and broken, only to fade against the might of entrenched European powers. France's own forces in the region were no exception. They were starving, poorly equipped, forgotten by their leaders in Paris, and positioned at the very edge of defeat. Yet within this moment of absolute despair, a shift occurred so sudden, so electrifying, that history would forever mark it as the dawn of a new era. The soldiers expected nothing but another commander sent to oversee their slow, inevitable collapse. But what arrived was a presence that cut through their hopelessness like a blade. He saw not ruin, but potential, not weakness, but opportunity. He spoke to them not with hollow promises, but with a conviction so fierce that it stirred something long buried within their ranks' belief. This campaign began not with the roar of gunfire, but with a spark that reignited an entire army. He understood something the world had never seen used with such deadly precision. That war was not merely about brute force, but about movement. Speed became his greatest weapon. In days, not weeks, he maneuvered his troops across treacherous mountain passes, striking where no general before him dared to attack. Where traditional armies waited, he advanced. Where they fortified, he overwhelmed. His strategy didn't just break the rules of the old world, it completely rewrote them. The battles that followed, Montenat, Lodiar-Hulich, became a new chapter in the rise of a military genius. He turned impossible terrain into his greatest advantage, turning rivers into traps and hills into launching grounds for his attacks. The enemy, though larger and far better supplied, found themselves paralyzed by his sheer unpredictability. His soldiers, once weary and starving, now moved with the ferocity of men who believed destiny itself marched right beside them. Italy, long a battleground for foreign powers, now witnessed a force unlike any it had ever seen. City after city fell, not through brutality, but through brilliance. Diplomats were outwitted, powerful coalitions were shattered, and entire governments were reshaped by a commander who understood that the pen could sometimes conquer even faster than the sword. Victories piled upon victories, and with each stunning triumph, the leaders of Europe began to realize what was forming in the shadows of those Italian mountains. This campaign was more than just a series of battles. It was a revelation. It was a terrifying demonstration of what intelligence, courage, and a relentless will could achieve when fused into a single, focused mind. By the campaign's end, the forgotten army had become a legend, and the world finally understood that a new power had entered the stage, one that would shake thrones, redraw the borders of nations, and forever change the art of war. Let's rewind to that critical moment. They handed him command of an army that was little more than a shadow. The men were worn down, their uniforms threadbare, their spirits cracked beneath years of brutal neglect. Hunger clung to their bones, and doubt weighed heavier than any of their weapons. On the Italian front, hope was a luxury that no one could afford. The generals who came before him had all tried to breathe life back into this force, and all had failed, leaving behind only frustration and the quiet, grim acceptance of defeat. Yet something shifted the very moment he arrived, not because of his rank or his reputation, but because of the way he saw them. Where others saw a lost cause, he saw an untapped storm. He didn't look at their torn boots or their empty packs. He looked into their eyes and saw what they had forgotten, the fire that had once made them proud soldiers of France. His voice carried no grand promises of comfort or riches. Instead, it carried truth, sharp and undeniable, cutting straight through the fog of despair. He told them the world would not give them anything. If they wanted glory, they would have to seize it. If they wanted survival, they would have to earn it. And if they wanted to rise from the ashes, They had to rise now. The men had grown accustomed to leaders who barked orders from behind the lines, men who demanded sacrifice but offered nothing in return. This one was different. He walked among them, studying the terrain, the artillery, the very air with an intense focus. He listened to the hardened veterans, noted their grievances, and answered not with platitudes, but with plans that were both daring and surgically precise. He didn't demand their trust, inspired Italiano. His confidence wasn't arrogance. It was a force that filled the camps like wildfire, awakening something they had almost forgotten. Belief in themselves. He gathered them for one speechy moment that would mark the beginning of everything. Standing before men who had not tasted victory in far too long, he spoke as if he could already see their triumph carved into the mountains that surrounded them. He told them that they were not forgotten, not by history and not by destiny. Italy, he declared, was rich not only in soil but in opportunity, and it was theirs for the taking. Suddenly, the starving became hungry for more than just bread. They became hungry for victory. The weary felt a surge of strength return to their limbs. Even the officers, who were once deeply skeptical, found themselves drawn into the undeniable gravity of his vision. What followed was not a miracle. It was a transformation. The army straightened its collective spine. The soldiers sharpened their bayonets with a newfound purpose. The drums began to beat a little louder. Their footsteps grew a little firmer. The forgotten army, once dismissed as a hopeless cause, now carried the quiet fury of men who were determined to rewrite their own fate. And as they prepared to march into a campaign that would test them beyond every imaginable limit, one truth became crystal clear. This was not merely the beginning of a battle. This was the awakening of a force that would soon shake the very foundations of Europe. What marched next into the hills of Italy was no longer a defeated force, but an army reborn, driven not by supply lines or royal commands, but by pure conviction. Yet conviction alone could not win them a campaign against enemies who outnumbered them, outstayed them, and held the advantage of fortified positions carved into mountains and along rivers. To triumph, they needed something Europe had not yet seen, a way of war that moved faster, struck sharper, and thought further ahead than any general of the old world could possibly imagine. He understood this before a single shot was ever fired. For centuries, tradition had shaped warfare. Slow, predictable maneuvers, and rigid formations bound by outdated rules. The armies opposing them relied on these methods, supremely confident that a starving French force could never challenge their entrenched positions. But he looked at those same mountains, valleys, and rivers not as obstacles, but as opportunities waiting to be seized with daring and precision. Movement became their new strength. Orders that once took days to deliver and execute were now carried out in mere hours. His troops marched through the dead of night in raging storms, crossing terrain the enemy believed to be utterly impassable. Bridges were built in silence under the cover of darkness. Artillery was dragged across sheer cliffs where no wheels had ever touched before. The enemy generals, bound by the comfort of their own traditions, simply could not understand how an army so exhausted could suddenly appear where logic said it could not possibly be. And that confusion became the first and most powerful weapon of the campaign. The men themselves moved with an energy that astonished even them. The fire he had lit within their hearts now drove their bodies across landscapes that would have broken them just weeks before. Each march felt purposeful, each maneuver part of a grand vision larger than any one soldier could see. And yet, they trusted that the vision existed. They felt it in the precision of the commands, in the confidence of their formations, and in the sudden, shocking victories that followed their every daring step. At the Battle of Montenat, they struck with the speed of lightning, dividing enemy forces that were thought to be unbreakable. At Lodi, they charged across a narrow bridge under a terrifying storm of musket fire, a moment that transformed frightened recruits into living legends. At Arcole, they crossed treacherous marshland that swallowed infantry whole, fighting waist-deep in mud against rivals who believed no sane commander would ever attempt such an assault. But sanity had little place in this new method of war. Brilliance did. Each victory was not merely a battle won, it was a revelation. The enemy realized, far too late, that they were not facing an army in the traditional sense. They were facing momentum made flesh, a force that simply refused to fight on old, predictable terms. Diplomats scrambled to make sense of the chaos. Powerful coalitions wavered, and across Europe, urgent whispers began to circulate. Something unprecedented was happening in Italy. This young general wasn't just winning, he was changing the game itself, and the world was struggling to keep up. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more chapters from history. See you next time. The soldiers themselves felt it too. Every morning, they awoke, not as the forgotten men they once were, but as instruments of a rising storm. The mountains echoed with their footsteps. Villages watched in awe as they advanced, not as marauders, but as a disciplined, determined tide. Even the enemy, upon seeing the impossible speed of their maneuvers, felt a sense of unease spreading through their ranks. They were fighting not only men, but an idea. The idea that war could be reshaped, reinvented, and accelerated beyond anything their doctrines had prepared them for. Through cunning, through motion, through audacity sharpened into strategy, the campaign began to turn Italy into the cradle of a legend. What had started as the desperate march of a neglected force was evolving into something far greater. A demonstration that intelligence could overpower numbers, that will could break fortifications, and that one mind's vision could move an entire army like a single unstoppable entity. What emerged from this relentless momentum was not merely a successful campaign, but the shaping of a legend. Victories had begun as sparks, moments of brilliance on isolated fields. But now they burned together into a single roaring flame that illuminated every corner of Italy. Cities that had once dismissed the French army as ragged intruders now opened their gates in awe, some in fear, many in admiration. Diplomats, nobles, and rulers watched the advancing tide, and understood that something beyond ordinary conquest was unfolding. This was the birth of a force that did not simply defeat enemies, it reshaped the very meaning of power. Each victory brought more than territory. It brought confidence, loyalty, and the realization among the troops that they were part of something greater than themselves. The men who had once marched with hollow eyes now carried themselves with pride, knowing that every step they took was carving a place for them in the chronicles of history. When they passed through towns, people whispered of them as if they were witnessing the rise of a myth. Some claimed they moved faster than news itself, appearing in places the enemy insisted were impossible to reach. Rumors transformed into legends, and legends fed the spirit of the army. But beyond the thunder of battle and the applause of liberated cities was a deeper transformation, one happening within the commander himself. Italy became the canvas upon which he painted the first strokes of his destiny. The diplomacy he crafted, the treaties he shaped, the alliances he forged, were not merely tools of war. They were foundations for something larger. Something that stretched far beyond the Alpine front. He negotiated like a statesman, maneuvered like a strategist, and seized opportunities like a man who glimpsed a future no one else dared imagine. The campaign was no longer just a military effort. It had become a political ascension. Enemy generals began to fear him, not because of overwhelming numbers, but because they realized they were facing a mind that anticipated them to, sometimes 3 moves ahead. Even monarchs in distant courts felt their confidence waver. Letters from ambassadors carried warnings. A new power was rising, one that threatened the balance of Europe itself. Italy, fractured by old rivalries and weakened by decades of foreign influence, found in him not just a conqueror but a force capable of unifying its scattered states under a single vision. He reshaped outdated administrations, imposed new systems of governance, and demanded efficiency where corruption had long taken root. Roads were repaired, laws reorganized, and local leaders compelled to cooperate not through intimidation alone, but through the sheer weight of his competence. He did not just seize Italy, he reinvented it. And with each reform, the idea of empire began to take shape, subtle at first, then unmistakable. He was no longer a commander winning battles. He was a leader forging a new order. The army felt it. The people sensed it. The world, watching anxiously, understood it. Italy was becoming the birthplace, not only of his glory, but of a force that would soon stretch beyond borders, beyond cultures, beyond anything Europe had seen since the ancient Caesars. The soldiers who once shivered from cold and hunger now marched with the certainty of men who knew they were part of a rising sun. Their victories were not just military achievements. They were symbols, proof that greatness could emerge from the forgotten, the underestimated, the hungry. Their commander had shown them that the impossible could be rewritten, that destiny could be seized one battle at a time. By the end of the Italian campaign, the continent no longer spoke of France's struggling army. They spoke of its unstoppable commander. They spoke of a man whose victories had shattered coalitions, humbled empires, and reshaped the geography of power. They spoke of a figure carving for himself a place above generals, above politicians, above the limits that history had imposed on every leader before him. From the mountains of Italy rose, not just triumph, but transformation, the first full emergence of a presence that would soon redefine Europe, topple kings, forge nations, and set the world on a path from which it would never return. The Italian campaign did more than secure victories on foreign soil. It revealed the arrival of a force capable of bending history to its will. From a starving, forgotten army arose a power that stunned Europe, not through sheer numbers, but through intelligence, momentum, and unshakable purpose. What began as a desperate struggle for survival became the proving ground of a mind destined to alter the fate of nations. Italy witnessed the transformation of chaos into order, defeat into dominance, and ambition into destiny. The mountains, rivers, and battlefields of this campaign became the first echoes of a legend that would soon thunder across the continent. And as the smoke of Italy cleared, one truth stood undeniable. The rise forged in those crucibles was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of transformation and legend as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you next time.